Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining AIA Hong Kong webinar today. Today's title is Every Building Counts, Keeping 1.5 Degree Alive. This is going to be presented by Edward Mazria, FAIA, and also the gold medalist of AIA in 2021. AIA develops a strategic plans every 5 years, which lay out key principles to guide our institute. In the strategic plan 2021 to 25, the number one items, number one key principles, which we are here to is urgency for architects in addressing the climate change that has been so essential to our society these days. The global climate crisis requires immediate, bold action to bring about meaningful change. Underpinned by AIA recent big movement towards environmental stewardship, the strategic plan amplifies this call to action for our members to redouble our efforts to develop solutions that will address the existential challenge of our time. So today's speaker, Edward Mazria, is at the forefront in driving these ambitions. And we are very honored to have Ed with us today. To join us also is the moderator of today's event, Dr. Christine Bruckner. Christine is very well known within our AIA community, both locally and internationally. She has been a former president of AIA International, as well as AIA Hong Kong. She's also the former chair of the International Practice Committee Advisory Group, and she's very active with promoting sustainability, urban design, waterfront initiative in the city. So with that, I'm passing this to Christine.
Hello, everybody. Christine Bruckner here. Thank you so much, Florence. Good afternoon. And it is my absolute honor to introduce you to a wonderful architect and friend, Edward Mazria, FAIA. Ed is an architect who has been a transformational figure in architecture for over 4 decades. He is the CEO and founder of Architecture 2030, an organization I'm sure you are familiar with that has been developing real-world solutions since 2006 that address global issues of energy, urbanization, and climate change. So at that time, which was quite pivotal, our American Institute of Architects, along with many other organizations, cities, countries, adopted this 2030 challenge. And in fact, that same time, Ed delivered the keynote at COP21 in Paris and hosted the first Zero Emissions by 2050 event. He's been doing amazing things, and he's been recognized around the world with many recognitions, including the Purpose Prize, the Mumford Award for Architects and Designers and Planners for Social Responsibility, the NWF National Conservation Achievement Award, Game Changers Award from Metropolis Magazine, American Solar Energy Society, Pioneer and Horace Greeley Abbott Awards, and some real Lifetime Achievement Awards. The Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Council for Science and the Environment, the Chairman's Award from the World Green Building Council, a 2020 Lifetime Achievement recipient for the Design Futures Council, and a Lifetime Award from the Consortium for Sustainable Urbanization. And from the AIA, the Kemper Award, and of course, the 2021 Gold Medal. So we're just honored and delighted to have him with us today. And I'll just share personally, I did have the honor to meet Ed at an AIA convention conference, actually at the Northwest Pacific region in 2008. So right when he was just really getting started all around and raising a lot of awareness, his words were absolutely inspirational. And since then, stayed in touch and followed, and have been honored to actually introduce him here in Hong Kong in 2015, where he joined our Hong Kong Secretary for the Environment and spoke about Architecture 2030, urban climate initiatives, and towards zero emissions. And then he was able to join us in our AIA Shanghai chapter and speak with our members there. And last year, he was able to join us with the AIA International region and speak about time to quit. Let's just stop the fossil fuels. And so, of course, today we're delighted that he's just continuing to make that path clear on how we can keep the optimism and hope alive towards making sure that we keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius alive and that every building counts. So please join me in welcoming Ed Mazria, FAIA.
Thank you, thank you, Christina. We'll get right into the presentation in a minute, but before we do, I just want to acknowledge that China is huge. What happens in China really kind of sets the program for the whole world, really meeting the 1.5 because they're doing so much development. They produce so many goods and services. Their impact is huge, and they're making, really, when you look at it, they're making great strides. I just saw just today that in 2021, China produced more new wind power than the rest of the world combined just in that year. And you'll begin to see some of that. I didn't have that information when I put the presentation together. I just saw it yesterday, actually, a graph where, everybody's here, and then you have, China like this. So China is amazing in that it's able to move very, very quickly when it wants to do something, and we need that. But we also need the entire architecture, planning, landscape architecture, building sector, city development, our community to really step forward and lead, because as you'll see in the presentation, which we'll start in a minute, we're responsible for roughly half of all emissions worldwide, personally responsible. And so it's important that we really step up. And in many places, we really are stepping up. So I think you'll see that too. So we'll have a Q&A afterwards, a live Q&A, which should be interesting after the presentation. So let's go right to the presentation, and then we'll save time for the Q&A. The question is, can we meet the 1.5 degrees C planetary warming goal that was set out in the 2015 Paris Agreement? I believe the answer is yes. The answer is every building counts. So let's first understand where we're going so we don't end up someplace else and that we can meet the 1.5. There's an old saying in the US, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. So where are we going? Well, in 2021, the IPCC put out its report on carbon budgets. And you can see, to keep planetary warming at 1.5 degrees C, we have a carbon budget of 300 to 400 gigatons. That's for a good probability of CO2 that we can put up into the atmosphere from 2020 on. That is the budget. So what does that budget mean? Well, we emit roughly 40 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere every year. And from 2020, if we phase out CO2 emissions by 2050, which is what we see many countries talking about and experts talking about, that's 600 gigatons. That's less than a 50% probability of meeting the 1.5. So phasing out CO2 emissions by 2050 really doesn't give us a high probability. So what do we need to do? Well, the scientific community is calling for a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030. And we're all working to meet that. Well, if we follow that line straight down and we continue on that track, then that's 400 gigatons of CO2. That gives us a high probability of meeting the 1.5, and we phase out CO2 emissions by the year 2040. So how difficult is that? And how do we do it? Well, This is how we usually see global CO2 emissions by sector. So building operations is 27%, transportation 23%, a little bit less, and then industry is the big one, 43%. If we tease out the building sector and the built environment from industry, then we see that building materials and construction, that's really the core and shell, is another 10%. And then the additional construction, site work, infrastructure, HVAC, that's an additional 10% as well. So we see that almost half of all global emissions are attributed to the built environment and most of it to buildings. We also know that urban environments are responsible for 75% of all human-produced global greenhouse gas emissions. And of that, most of that comes from buildings in urban environments, in cities. You could see New York City, 71%, Copenhagen, 76%, Hong Kong, 60% of all its emissions come from its buildings. So buildings are critical in getting our emissions down. Now, this is something that historic has taken place since 2005. This is the US. The US since 2005 has been building. We had a little bit of slowdown with COVID, but we continue to build. And from 2005 to 2020, we added about 53 billion square meters, square feet to our building sector. Our buildings floor area grew about 19%. This is energy use and CO2 emissions in the building sector, in buildings. Our energy consumption in all our buildings in the US from 2005 to 2020 went down about 5%, and emissions dropped way down to 30%. So our emissions today are 30% below where they were in 2005 in the building sector, building operations. And that decoupling of being able to build and grow and reduce emissions is historic. We have never seen that happen before. If you build, energy consumption goes up, emissions go up, and that's the way it's always been. But all of a sudden, we're seeing a disconnect. What about worldwide? What are we seeing worldwide? So here's floor area from 2010 to 2020 over the last decade. Floor area in the world increased about 22%. So we're building. Worldwide, we're building. China's building, the US is building, Canada's building, Vietnam is building, everyone's building. So floor area is going up. So you'd expect energy consumption and emissions to go up. And yes, that's what happens. But all of a sudden, energy consumption from 2018 roughly flattens out and then slightly goes down due to COVID. But it's essentially flat. Even though floor area is still going up, even during COVID, floor area was still building. Energy consumption remains flat. And look what happens to emissions from 2018 on. It starts to drop pretty dramatically. And we're starting to see a decoupling worldwide, which is really very positive in the building sector. So how did that happen? What's going on? Well, solar became the cheapest electricity in history in 2020, 2019, 2020. And in 2021, renewable energy was the only energy source where demand increased and the consumption of all other fuels, fossil fuels, began to decline. So we began to see a shift away from fossil fuels to renewables. And we don't see that, and we don't see that changing anytime soon. In 2022, we expect a historic level of solar and wind energy. So let's take a look at how this has happened. This is world wind electricity generation from 1990 to 2021. You can see it starts out almost nothing. And then all of a sudden in 2005, 2010, it takes off. And then we see an explosion and a doubling time in roughly 5 years. We've actually doubled the amount of wind electricity generation in the world in 5 years. And that is expected to continue. What about world solar electricity generation? Well, you see the same thing. It starts out very, very small and doesn't even get started till about 2010, 2012. And then we see an explosion. And in 2-3 years, we see a doubling of worldwide solar electricity generation. And that's because it has become the cheapest form of electricity generation worldwide. What about China? We see the same explosion. This is just the last decade from 2010 to 2021. We see an explosion in wind electricity generation in China, a huge amount. And we see the same thing with China's solar electricity generation. So China's also building out renewables at an incredible pace. The US, we see the same thing. This is US wind on the left and electricity on the right. We see an explosion. So that's why we're seeing that downturn in electricity emissions in the building sector. We're starting to see that decoupling. This is world electricity generation, 2010 to 2021. And we see that in 2010, you see that renewables and non-CO2 emitting electricity generation was about 33% of total electricity generation. In 2021, it's moved up to slightly over 40% of total electricity generation. The problem is, we've increased the amount of electricity we need. Renewable supplied part of it, but the problem is that coal and gas also increased. So emissions in the electricity generation increased somewhat by about 11%. What about China? This is China. You can see on the left, that's 2010 was mostly coal. 21% was non-CO2 emitting, renewables, nuclear, and hydro. So it was a small percentage. And then there was an explosion, obviously, from 2010 to 2020, an explosion in electricity generation in China. And renewables picked up almost half of that explosion. And the bad news is coal picked up the other half, and electricity CO2 emissions went up 32%. So what do we do? How do we get a handle on all this? And can we meet the 1.5 degree C carbon budget? As I said, I think yes. I don't think it's that difficult, and I'll tell you why. We need to do 3 things to get the entire built environment under control and get it to zero emissions. We need to address new buildings, existing buildings, and then materials, construction, and infrastructure, what we call embodied carbon. Let's begin with new buildings. That's building operations. How do we get that under control? Well, it's a 2-step process. Step 1 are the things we do: planning, design, and construction. And it's a no-brainer. You electrify, no on-site fossil fuels. If you do that, you can get 70 to 80% of the way to zero carbon, no cost, low cost, or even cost savings. And you do that by how you plan out developments, cities, walkable communities, bring agriculture into the cities, urban agriculture, how you design buildings, how you orient buildings, where you put the glazing, how you shade buildings, natural ventilation, and then the types of materials you use. You can get 70 to 80% reduction just through design strategies. Then step 2 is you make up the rest with renewable energy, non-fossil fuel energy, no on-site natural gas, no coal, you do it all with renewables, because you bring your energy consumption so low that it's easy to then do it with renewables. And I'll show you that in a minute. You do it with on-site solar. You can do it with wind, utility scale solar, wind, geothermal, hydro. There's all sorts of strategies that we can use to make up the energy consumption that the building sector and the built environment needs. And in terms of planning, it's been outlined for China, for example, low carbon cities. There's 10, I think 8 to 10 different strategies to use to develop planning guidelines, that develop planning guidelines for new development in China. That's available. There's also the 2030 palette, which contains many of those same strategies, everything from how you develop out a region, how do you look at a region, city, town, how do you do that, districts, how do you plan districts for transit, for example, site work so that you sequester carbon, and then how do we look at buildings, the building shape, daylighting strategies, passive heating and cooling strategies, and materials. How do we do all that? It's all contained in the 2030 palette. You can get that online at 2030palette.org. So we know all the strategies in order to design very low energy and low carbon buildings. And also we have now codes. It's a simple two-step process to design a zero carbon building. First, just design an efficient building. Meet the latest code standards. They're usually pretty good. Or you can find even a good one if the code in your area is not good. But most building codes now, building energy codes, are pretty good and will give you a fairly efficient building. And then you can add all those strategies we talked about, daylighting strategies, passive heating, cooling, ventilation, and get the consumption, energy consumption of a building down even more. So that's the first thing. First thing, design an efficient building using the codes and then all the strategies that you have available that don't cost anything. Then the second thing is no on-site fossil fuels. Address the remaining building's energy needs with on-site renewables, on-site solar. If you can't do it that way, then do some of it that way and bring in the rest off-site, bring in renewable energy. In that way, you've designed a zero carbon building and built one. What about all those existing buildings? Building operations, there are literally hundreds of thousands and millions of buildings worldwide. How do we get those to zero carbon? Well, the formula is exactly the same. We renovate them for efficiency when we can. We electrify them, get rid of any on-site fossil fuels, and then bring in renewable energy, either on-site and or off-site. We get them to zero carbon. And in Hong Kong, we know that 90% of the electricity used in Hong Kong goes just for buildings, which are responsible for about 60% of all Hong Kong's emissions. The other thing we know about Hong Kong is that 2/3 of all the emissions from the building sector comes from the commercial sector. And many of these are these very, very large buildings that are responsible for a lot of emissions. So we can develop a two-step process. We can take those large buildings and figure out where they are, how many they are, to get to about 50% of total emissions. It won't be that many because they're so big. And we require them to get to zero carbon by 2030 and give them incentives to do it. You give them plenty of time to do it, where they'll hit a capital improvement cycle and they can get rid of the on-site, any on-site fossil fuels and electrify. And then now you have many smaller buildings, obviously, that are responsible for the other 50%, and you give them all the way to 2040, and you look for intervention points when you can get them to go all electric, reduce their on-site and eliminate their any on-site fossil fuels, give them incentives to do it, when they renovate, when they change out equipment, give them incentives to change, and require, for example, at a point of sale, if you sell a building, you have to then bring your building up to zero carbon standards. In that way, by 2040, we've transformed the entire building sector in a city. Well, what about all those materials, the construction and the infrastructure that goes along with buildings? There are literally hundreds of thousands of choices of materials, and we have to get them all to zero carbon in order to phase out CO2 emissions by the year 2040. How do we do that? Well, this is the pie chart that we looked at before. We see that building operations, and then is 27%, and then construction and infrastructure is another 20%. But there are literally hundreds of thousands of materials within that 20%. What do we do? Well, we reshaped the pie a little bit, and we see that in industry, in the entire industrial sector, two materials, just steel and concrete, are responsible for half of all industrial emissions. So if we focus on those two, we can get huge reductions very, very quickly. The first thing that has to happen is everyone needs to know that those two materials are huge when it comes to emissions, and we see that now. Beginning in 2019, it became known that concrete produced a huge amount of global emissions. We've seen lots of publicity and articles about concrete and steel. So there's a lot of pressure that's being built on those two materials to decarbonize. And we're starting to see that. And there's also, especially in the global north, there's also competition from glue laminated and cross laminated timber, mass timber buildings. And we're starting to see now mass timber used in high-rise buildings. And that's pushing concrete and steel to decarbonize even faster. So that's the good news. So what can we do as professionals, as architects and planners and policymakers? Well, we can look at the sector three ways: reuse, reduce, and sequester. Let's talk about reuse. The greenest building, development, or neighborhood is one that's already built. This way you don't have to build out all the infrastructure. You just repurpose it and upgrade it. You use lots less material, lots less transportation, and you cut down on your embodied carbon dramatically by doing that. Renovating, existing buildings. After COVID, we're beginning to change how we use buildings. So reusing them and redesigning them using recycled materials is another option. And we can build our buildings so that when their useful life is over, we can at least reuse the materials so we don't have to keep rebuilding those materials. So reuse is one of the options we have. The other is reduce. Growth boundaries. We talked about urban planning, infill and densification, so that we use the existing infrastructure that we have. We optimize it. We can optimize building structure also, specify low carbon materials. We have lots of programs now that are coming out that will compare the different amount of carbon in making different materials so we can select lower carbon materials. And we're beginning to see public policy shape around that. The last thing is we can sequester carbon. We can actually draw down carbon by using, for example, timber, or in the global south, we're beginning to see a nascent industry grow up in glue laminated and cross laminated bamboo, which is actually stronger and more flexible than mass timber. We're beginning to see injecting CO2 into concrete, making aggregate out of CO2 emissions and changing its properties. So actually drawing down CO2 and looking at biomaterials made with renewable energy rather than fossil fuel energy. And all of a sudden, we're beginning to see an explosion in landscapes, soil, and urban agriculture, where landscape architects now are looking at how to actually draw down carbon in their site work and in cityscapes. So there's all sorts of strategies that we can bring to bear on this subject. I want to leave you with this. This is the amount of solar energy that falls on a square meter in a year on a surface. So just a square meter. And this is Singapore, Hong Kong, Sydney, New York. So from way south to way north. In brown is roof. This is how much falls on kilowatt hours per square meter per year in a year on a square meter. In brown on the roof, yellow on the south on a square meter of south facade, and then a cross between yellow and brown, east and west facade, a square meter. I'll put this in play. So this is how much energy you get on 4 surfaces in a year in kilowatt hours per square meter. Now, how much energy per square meter, again, in kilowatt hours per square meter per year, how much energy does a building need to operate if it meets a relatively good code standard? Doesn't have to be the best, but a decent code standard like ASHRAE 90.1 2016. Well, you're looking at somewhere between 100 kilowatt hours a square meter to probably upward of 140 kilowatt hours a square meter, whether it's an office building, apartment building, or school. So on the right, in those red bars, that's how much energy you need to operate a building if you just use a good code. If you look to the left and you look at Hong Kong, that's how much energy you get in a square meter. So again, that's a square meter of building operations on the right, a square meter of how much energy that actually strikes a surface in a year per square meter in Hong Kong, on the south side, on the roof, and on the east and west facade. There is so much additional energy that falls on a building that we can now capture. We're looking at all sorts of things, vertical panels on the east and west side, panels on photovoltaic panels on the roof. We're looking at solar glazing now. That's an industry that's just now starting up, where the glass actually generates electricity when the sun shines on it. So there's all sorts of ways to do this. So that's how much energy we get free. That's delivered free to pretty much every site if it's unshaded on the left. And that's how much we need on the right to operate a square meter of building. Of course, we can solve this problem. If we move forward together and we begin to implement our design strategies, planning strategies, and use non-fossil fuels, CO2 emitting energy, especially renewables, wind and solar, we will keep 1.5 degrees C alive. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ed. Fantastic. So many positive messages in there about how we can really go forward, have a clear roadmap and real-time solutions. I think there are some questions that have risen up. Maybe I'll start them, and I encourage all of our colleagues listening and joining us today to share your own questions in the Q&A, and we'll get them all to Ed till we have plenty of time for that discussion, which is wonderful. I guess just starting with the first facts that you shared, it's phenomenal that the wind energy has doubled over these last 5 years, and solar energy has also doubled over even a shorter period. So much is happening with that can really reduce emissions. Of course, this is as long as we can continue to reduce our own needs and make sure that fossil fuels reduce not only by percentage, but in a measurable amount. I think at the beginning, you started to share that you had some new figures about what was going on in China with wind and other things in the region. Maybe now, having heard the story, you might just reshare that or give it a little bit of a different perspective, and then we have another follow-up question to that.
Yeah, I think, the International Energy Agency and the Energy Information Administration, they all put out statistics, but they're always a year or two behind. You don't get what happened in 2021 or what's happening in the first few quarters of 2022. But you do get articles on that somebody does that certain organizations are doing studies. So while we see a decoupling, which is really positive,
Yes.
I mean, to see energy consumption flatten, building square footage go up, but energy consumption flatten, and then emissions go down, even though energy consumption is still flat, it hasn't gone down, but it's flattened out. By flattening out, you're not using more energy. So every time then you add, you take away fossil fuels or you add renewables, you're taking away fossil fuels. That's what's generating the drop, because energy consumption is not going up. So you're substituting. We're beginning to see that, and 2021 seems to be the articles that I'm beginning to see now, especially out of China. We're beginning to see even more growth in 2021. And then just recently, the International Energy Agency is predicting that 2022 will be as good as 2021 or even better. So if we're designing buildings to be more efficient, we're renovating buildings to be more efficient, they're canceling each other out, the new buildings and the renovations, right? And we're now adding all this renewables. It's reducing fossil fuels and carbon emissions. And we're starting to see that. We're starting to see phasing out of coal generation, which is the first order of business, because it's the most polluting. We're beginning to see a phase out. Even in the US, it's been talked about that we've had a setback with the Supreme Court saying, oh, you can't regulate out coal, for example. Well, they're talking about an old legislation that was proposed that never actually even got done. So it was dead anyway. And all the projections are that we're closing down coal plants at a record pace, and nobody's stopping that because it's too expensive. Why do we need it? The reports I see coming out of China is that solar is now so cheap that it's cheaper to just get rid of the coal and switch. You actually save money, even though you maybe have to finance it and all that. So I think economically, we're seeing this shift, and with inflation and other things going on, everybody's looking to save. Our community. I mean, giving me the gold medal in 2021 was a recognition that our industry has changed. It would usually be a starchitect or, somebody doing, fantastic work. And there's still many of them around. But somehow they made a switch and recognized. And I think you're going to see that more and more, that all the industry associations are really recognizing those who are addressing this issue of emissions, of climate change, of adaptation. Adaptation is now, we're starting to see so many disasters. We're beginning to now all of a sudden focus on, wait a minute, we better deal with this heat island effect in urban environments. Otherwise it's incredibly stressful for people. So we're seeing these shifts take place very, very quickly, and our industry is responding, and every professional organization is responding. All our major firms are responding. I think it's not like the 1970s where it was where we had a manufactured energy crisis and everybody got in gear and everything, and then they dropped the price of fossil fuels through the floor and everybody sort of forgot about it. Well, not everybody forgot about it. And this crisis is not going away. It just keeps getting worse and worse. So the amount of activity that I'm seeing now is incredible in this area. That's why I think we will solve this problem. I really do. Every industry is working on it now.
That's fantastic. Very optimistic. You mentioned something that was at a larger scale, and maybe this would be a time to jump to a question that we had on, understanding and asking you to share some of the district and citywide solutions that you and Architecture 2030 have developed, and maybe to share how they, could minimize emissions, maximize their positive impact at that larger scale.
Yeah, there are a few. There are a number of people working in that area. I mean, we work in that area, but we really rely on the planners, and so I'm seeing a number of things. One is a number of years ago, actually, it was Peter Calthorpe working with Energy Foundation China, Climate Works, and a bunch of groups worked in China developing a number of guiding principles for development in China, walkable communities, small blocks, ways to reduce carbon. It culminated in a few publications. One was called Low Carbon Cities, and you can all, I think Peter still goes back and forth to China. You can contact him and get those. He's also writing a book for the World Bank, which will be out very soon. I kind of got a preview of it, and it's those same principles, same guiding principles, only now he's expanded it from China to essentially worldwide, and the global South. He's come up with some really interesting things, like electrifying bicycles and scooters and stuff like that. Actually beats mass transit in terms of getting people around and lowering carbon dramatically. So he did a study for Ho Chi Minh City and things like that. So anyway, all those limiting, densifying, compact development, minimizing infrastructure, less concrete. I mean, they're all, we know all those strategies, and the planners now are beginning to pick those up. So that's all coming at the next COP, which will be in North Africa, coming in November in Egypt. I think Peter's book should be out by then. And so we'll have him present all the planning strategies at a session at that COP. The second thing we're seeing now is all of a sudden the landscape architects have gotten energized and have been looking at landscapes and site work to draw down carbon. So it's actually a drawdown. So you can actually now sequester carbon in site work, in landscapes, in streetscapes, in cityscapes. And they now have a program that they've just developed. I forget the name of it. It'll come to me. On calculating that, you can calculate how much you can actually draw down. So their profession is beginning to now take a very active role in drawdown. So it's not, putting out carbon, it's actually drawing down carbon in landscapes over a period of time. So it's a new field. It's just starting, and it's very, very exciting. You know, on that scale, obviously infill is huge. If you can, you know, if you don't have to build new infrastructure and you can infill, you save an enormous amount. If you can renovate buildings rather than tearing them down, it's huge savings in concrete and steel and things like that. So that movement is now growing. And with COVID, you're seeing a lot of repurposing of office buildings, things like that. People are working in different situations. You've got to renovate these things. So that all saves carbon. So, you know, we're beginning to see all this take place in the design and planning communities. I keep an eye out for the book that Peter Kelthorpe's putting out. I think that one will have a list of strategies that are not difficult to implement, that really get at the heart of larger scale planning. Small blocks, for example, rather than these mega blocks where you have to get in, you know, you got to get in a car and get on a 6-lane highway in order to, you know, go get some groceries and things like that. Walkable communities. I mean, all those things that are so positive. He's really putting those out in a format that I think is very usable for people. So we'll see that. We'll as soon as we get it, we'll get it out to everybody.
Excellent, excellent. And then on that note, of course, it's amazing what we can be doing at the city scale, in the gardens, the landscapes. But of course, we're speaking here to many of our members, architects. And I think the fact that we can reduce our carbon by 70 or 80% just through designing energy efficient buildings is critical. And I think if there are some elements to that we can focus on, you know, the real design strategies, of course, the electrification with a new building. But I wonder if there's a method or two as an architect speaking to architects that you would like to specifically raise awareness to, or that you've seen has sort of had a maximum reduction with a minimum input, something that we can go away and do, or a resource that you might like to link us to. I think that would be fantastic. There's a lot of opportunity here.
Well, there's a few things. The first thing is what I want to dispel, because we don't ever want to hear this, is my client doesn't let me do it or doesn't want it or whatever. It's the client's fault. I can't do it. The client, you know, we make all the design decisions. They don't tell us the shape of the building. They don't tell us, you know, how we lay out the spaces. They don't tell, I mean, you know, a specification book of materials is, you know, this thick. It's like an encyclopedia. They don't look through everything we specify. As long as we keep the building in budget, give them a really beautiful building, and that works, they're happy. So all of the decisions that we make, we literally, as design professionals, as designers, we literally make thousands of choices, knowledgeable choices, as we go through the process. And every choice is a trade-off in a sense. You can trade one thing off for another, as long as you're bringing the building in budget. So we can look at, so what are the strategies? We can look at? And we looked at all these strategies, by the way, in the 70s at the first energy crisis. We were bringing buildings in, you know, at 20% of what a normal building would use in terms of energy. We were reducing energy consumption 80% just through design strategies back in the 70s. So we know them all. Daylighting. If you have a day use facility and you're daylighting, you have you don't have any lights on. So we know that if you're bringing light in from the side, for example, you can throw it a certain distance. So if you have a building shape where you're getting light in from two sides, you want to make it, you know, not a huge thick box where you have huge spaces in the middle that you can't get daylighting in if it's multi-story. you thin it out and you know, tease it around and you get daylighting in there. So daylighting is a strategy number one, especially for day use facilities. They're better used, they're healthier, you know, I mean, you don't use all that energy. That's one strategy. If you're in the mountains, for example, or you're up north in a cold climate, passive heating is a no-brainer. If you just orient the glazing the right way, how you let sun into a space, 70% of the energy that comes through the glass, it's the most efficient way to capture heat. You just let it in through a window, turns into heat. As soon as it hits materials and stuff, turns into heat. And depending upon the materials, you can actually store that heat in the materials, comes back into the space at night. Now, you have to be careful because in most northern climate stuff, you also have a summer and it'll get hot, hot. And so you want to make sure you shade that glazing so that in the summertime, you open it up, you get cross ventilation, you don't get any sunlight in there, and you use that material inside that you were storing the heat to actually store cool, we call it cool, at night. So you ventilate the building at night, cool all the interior materials down, close the windows during the day, for example, the building's shaded, you have an air-conditioned space without any energy source. So passive heating, passive cooling, daylighting, natural ventilation, how you lay out streets and plan streets and the vegetation, a heat island effect has a huge effect on the building's energy consumption. So those strategies come into play. The 2030 palette that we put together draws on a lot of that and has many of those strategies and sizing procedures, just rules of thumb. Because that's how, when we design, everything is a rule of thumb. We design an entire building through all of the different rules of thumb that we have in our head, right? A corridor has to be this wide. We need to have exits. We need to do this. These are all rules of thumb. So these rules of thumb are how to get your energy consumption down, to get that 70 to 80% down. Then you have to make up the rest. And now with solar so cheap and inexpensive, you can do it on site. Storage is now just dropped down dramatically. There's like a 80–90% drop from 10, 15 years ago in terms of energy storage, electricity storage. So this is all coming together now at the right time. And as professionals, as long as we just educate ourselves, we can get that 70 to 80% down and then use renewables. On the city scale, we've also done a whole number of studies on cities, and we find something fascinating, that there are what we call big buildings and small buildings that make up the entire building sector, right? So if you have these huge buildings, that one building uses a huge amount of energy because it has so much square meters and it's huge, right? And it would take 400 small buildings using each a little amount of energy to make up the energy of that big building, right? Well, who owns these huge buildings? Right? These are not the poor people here who own, 50, 80-story buildings. They have money. Every building undergoes a renovation cycle or a capital improvement cycle at some point. It's usually at about every 7 years, something like that. When you undergo a capital improvement cycle, you're changing out equipment, you're fixing equipment, you're redoing lighting, you're redoing floor areas, things like that. At that time, it's so inexpensive to upgrade the building for efficiency and to do your efficiency renovations at that time, because all the setup costs, the workmen are there, everything else. All you're doing is actually substituting a more efficient piece of equipment for an equipment you were going to change anyway. So the upgrade is small. So if you require those big, huge buildings, you start from the biggest building in the city and work your way down till you get to 50%. You'll only have a small number of buildings. You'll get 50% of all energy consumption and emissions. You require them, you give them to 2030, 8 years, they'll hit a capital improvement cycle. You require them to get to zero carbon. Electrify when you do it, you know, give them incentives to do it too. Give them some tax incentives, some tax breaks. It doesn't cost them anything. You will get huge reductions very, very quickly. Then you address all those, you know, you don't want thousands of people screaming bloody murder, you're making me do this, you're making me do that. A few buildings, yeah, okay, they can do it, they have money. Then you work with all the rest of the people, give them incentives. When they're going to undertake a renovation, you give them incentives to go to zero carbon and get them and get it so that their outlay help them with financing, pay off the renovation. They have a better building, it's less expensive to run, and the better resale value. So those two strategies, the big building, small building strategies, and you give the smaller buildings all the way out to 2040. So you'll capture all of the buildings. We did a study for New York and they're implementing that now, the big building strategy, and then point of sale for the small building strategy, because in New York, over the next 20 years, pretty much every building is going to change hands. It'll be sold, the smaller buildings, or most of them. And so at that point, usually the new person coming in is doing some renovation, is, you know, changing out a few things. They give them financing, incentives, require them to get to zero carbon. So we know how to do this. It's all available. I think it's achieving zero .org is a website that explains all of that. Or you can go to architects2030.org and look for big buildings, small buildings, and it'll give you all those statistics from different cities.
Excellent. I have a few more questions, but I'd like to honor some of our guests who are listening. Good friend Peter Basmajian has a few, so let's combine them. He'd like to know if the IEA chart is the most accurate in terms of depicting where emissions are coming from. And he also, I'll just tie it in, he's also asked if it makes any sense to be cutting down mature trees and using them for building structure. So he's asking about that.
Yeah. The International Energy Agency has papers out and studies on the latest information on their diagrams, and you know, where you can actually go in and see over time graphs and everything else. They go to 2019 and some countries and stuff to 2020. So it's you're not getting the latest, but you can get the latest from the studies if you go deep in and get the latest report before they put it online. So the IEA, International Energy Agency, is one place. The other place is the Energy Information Administration. That's a US based. They also have an international portion to it, update. And their latest is 2021, but I believe they still go to 2020 and they just project 2021. So we're not, I think pretty soon, within the next few months, we should get complete 2021 numbers. Now, as far as wood goes, most of the timber for timber construction comes from the global north right now. So you're looking, you know, at Canada, northern United States, or way global south is where most of the mass timbers, they're mostly the softwoods. In the US and Canada, and even I'm understanding in parts of the EU, most of the forests are managed, that the timber comes from, are managed forests. We conducted a big meeting about 2 or 3 years ago from all the organizations, a lot of the environmental organizations, to talk about mass timber and wood. And what we're finding is that mass timber was coming from managed forests was totally underutilized. And the tree canopy in the global north is actually expanding, not contracting. So we're not seeing deforestation in the global north where timber comes from. Now, we may get to a point where we saturate all of the timber that's coming from managed forests, from sustainably managed forests. At that point, then you don't want to see clear cutting and things like that and habitat loss. But as of now, our understanding is there's plenty of timber to go around. And they want to see the jobs come back that they lost because nobody was using it for a while. The deforestation we're seeing is actually in the global south along the equator, are really the tropical forests. And that deforestation is happening not because of timber construction, those are mostly hardwoods, but because of agriculture, because of clearing for agriculture and beef and farming and things like that. That's why the urban agriculture movement, bringing agriculture back into the city and actually growing things in the city, is really so important. You save on all of that. We looked at, for example, South America, for example, the Amazon, and you see, build a road into the Amazon, you carve out a little piece of land, you get a few people living there, then all of a sudden they clear a bunch of forests, then you get more people coming in, and before you know it, all of the land, it's a little bit of building, a small town, but farmers and stuff, and then huge swaths of the Amazon gone to agriculture. And that's kind of how it happens. We've got to stop that. That can't be the way we go. And so urban agriculture, I think, is one of the solutions, and it could be high-rise urban agriculture. We're starting to see that. I think outside of Shanghai or in Shanghai, there's a big development that either happened or is happening on bringing agriculture back into the city. It's such a beautiful way to do things. Atop of buildings, you have all, space, cover it with a greenhouse. You save on all sorts of things, heating, cooling, you name it, and you grow food. So that's where the deforestation is. The nice thing we're also seeing in Southeast Asia, for example, is bamboo. Bamboo is a weed. I mean, or it's a grass, I guess, not a weed, it's a grass. Grows very fast. You harvest it in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And you can laminate it. And my understanding is that you can create massive wood, beams and columns and things like that are actually more flexible and stronger than mass timber that's coming out of the global north. Grows faster, you could harvest it and just grow it right back. That could be huge.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, as far as the edibles, I mean, we're definitely doing that in our own offices and as many places as we can. So definitely greening our cities is phenomenal. I'd like to bring up a query from our colleague, Sam, where he's asking if you could comment on the increasing nuclear power. Would that be a good thing for the city of Hong Kong to achieve their carbon neutrality goals? And where do we stand on nuclear power? I think it's been going down in your charts, and where should it be going? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's going down because it's expensive. And to build a new nuclear plant is very expensive. And to get the same output, from wind and solar and hydro, geothermal, other options are less expensive. There's now a security issue, obviously, a global security issue that has, it's always been there, but now we're seeing it big time, right? And you attack a nuclear plant that's not fun and games. You attack a solar plant, you knock out a few panels here or there or whatever, and you throw them back up. While nuclear has played a role in non-CO2 emitting energy, the cost now is so prohibitive, and the parts have to come from very different places. We're not seeing it as a viable, scalable solution to the problem that we have to address very, very quickly. The great thing about wind and solar is, when you look in solar and you think about it, it's distributed free. You don't have to every site. And you look at where all the development, all the population growth, and all the development in the next 20 years, 30 years is going to take place in a band across the global south, really. The global north is losing population in certain areas and it's offsetting each other, but almost all of that growth, the amount of construction that's going to need to happen to house another 2 billion people, and the infrastructure and the schools and the office space and the services and everything else is going to be huge. If you look at where the energy is distributed free worldwide, every square meter, it's the global south. It's red and purple, whereas the global south, the global north is light blue and everything. You get 40% more energy per square meter in the global south than you do in the global north. So you need 40% less collector area to collect the same amount. And right now their energy consumption per person is much, much less. So you're talking about, in terms of savings and costs, huge. The scale is enormous. To build a reactor in that area, it's very sophisticated. You have a conflict that starts to happen. It becomes a #1 target. It's just, and it's just cost. It's just now cost prohibitive.
Yeah.
Is my feeling. Again, we did a whole bunch of in-depth studies years back on that, but I haven't investigated that recently, just because we haven't seen any explosion in that area, just because of what I'm talking about, cost and security.
Well, you raise a really great, I remember at many years ago, learning what we need to do as architects is take advantage of everything that comes through our site, the sun, the water, the wind. If we could all do that, we could absolutely reduce our touch on this planet and take care of it better together. We do have a couple more questions, and one is also about embodied carbon. So certainly when we're looking, we've always known the most sustainable building is the one that's already there, assuming it was built well and for longevity. So one of the questions has to do with, in Hong Kong, we tend to have those buildings removed so we can go a bit higher and wider. Sometimes it's not even adding as much square footage, but it's new. So we're looking at some options for how to address that. Meanwhile, we also are seeing a lot of uptick in how to adaptively reuse buildings and think about where they can go next in terms of the embodied carbon. And then the tangential to that is just received from one of my colleagues at the office where I'm at Moser, and we keep figuring out what is the embodied carbon of materials and furniture. And the reality is we have to learn how to figure that out for ourselves, which we do for our clients, because there are so few resources. So a little bit of a discussion on EPDs and what we can do to help smaller and medium companies to be able to afford and get them out there so that we can all be working at a level playing field. So kind of embodied 3 questions in there. Sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. You know, I think it was a conference in San Francisco where at that point we kind of rediscovered embodied carbon, and but we discovered we looked at embodied carbon as so complex, right? It's exactly what you're talking about. There are literally hundreds of thousands of materials, everything from furniture to carpets to different kinds of carpets to wall base to, I mean, you know, sheetrock to concrete block to brick to, I mean, you name it, it's got an embodied carbon footprint, right? And within a category, you have a huge number of products to choose from. And the rules for counting embodied carbon were very, very complex. And I remember working with my staff. There was one woman in our office, she wouldn't give up on embodied carbon. I threw my hands up. I said, I don't know how we're gonna ever get a handle on this, you know? Because you have, you know, product category rules you have to follow. They're set up by the industries. Anyway, it became, I lost a lot of sleep over embodied carbon. Finally, it hit us that steel and concrete were huge. And that just like big buildings, small buildings, there's a way to parse it out so that you give the small stuff time. Because if you try to get that done all at once, you can drive yourself crazy. So focusing on 2 products right away, we could do that. And so we focused on steel and concrete, on getting EPDs, on pushing the architecture community to, you know, request them, on getting them into, you know, a program that can compare them, EC3. So we put that out there and began there with like the big building, small buildings. We began with the big 2 products, and then we discovered the wood as an alternative. And architects love wood. This is just such a beautiful material. You see, I don't know, you can't see the house here, but I could have to turn it around. But anyway, there's beautiful laminated wood ceilings and stuff. That by promoting wood, all of a sudden, steel and concrete started to feel the pressure of, we're not going to do a concrete building. We're not going to do, you know, we're going to do a wood, mass wood timber building, high rise. Then all of a sudden the codes changed. We were allowing, you know, taller buildings out of wood. So all of a sudden now you're starting to see steel and concrete, the industries, the industry associations wanting to become as green as possible, as fast as possible. If we can get that, we can keep that going and get it to accelerate, injecting CO2 into concrete, making carbon positive, making aggregate, you know, alternatives to, you know, to cement and different ways to make it, and electric arc furnaces for rather than coal blast furnaces for making steel and using renewable electricity to make the steel, recycled steel, things like that. If we focus on that now, while we then get all the other industries to compete against each other, we're seeing that now, for example, in carpet. A lot of the carpet manufacturers recycle carpet using renewables to generate the fibers and everything else. Those industries are going to take time. If we can focus on the big two right away, we can get the reductions we need to get to that 50%, while all the other industries then are competing for us to specify them. Now, if you go into any architect's office, you will know that on a daily basis, a salesman will come by and want to give you a lunch or stock your library full of their products, right? That is the time to ask them for an EPD. Don't let them stock your library unless they give you an EPD. They'll come back, they'll get an EPD done. It's not expensive. A lot of cities now are actually paying for EPDs. When they're doing city buildings and things like that for manufacturers to do that. I call it the power of the pen or of the computer now, because we design on computers. If we don't specify it, they don't sell it. I mean, think about our huge firms, how much material we specify. We specify everything that goes into a building. We can ask for anything we want. They will give it to us. So it's up to us to ask for the EPDs, get that into the different programs. Then we commit max and look and play one off against the other until we get to low carbon. We're starting to see cities now, I think, are going to begin to legislate embodied carbon. I'm seeing a few things now where, for example, in New York State, there was some legislation. I don't know if it made it yet, but for any state buildings, for example, they will give you a discount for concrete, as one example. Even if you're not the low bidder, they will lower your bid by a certain percentage if you're the lowest carbon. And then if your bid beats out somebody higher, we're going to give it to you anyway, even though it might cost us a little more. They reduce it like 5% or something like that. Well, that's a race down to zero. The guy who loses out, he's not going to sit there and bid anymore on a state project unless he gets his carbon down, right, to beat the other guy out. So I think we're starting to see things like that take root in embodied carbon. But it just started a number of years ago, but it's moving that field is moving very, very quickly. You're on mute.
I'm very excited about that. Just to go back, there was that question was from our colleague Adrian Fung about Hong Kong, and he just was asking how you feel about the overall tendency of not letting buildings live a longer life in Hong Kong.
Yeah, so ripping buildings down. There's a lot of pressure, economic pressure, to do certain things. I think you're probably going to have to see policy take root, and I think, well, we're coming out with a tool very, very soon. It's been in development now by a number of architects and organizations, called the CARE tool. And what it will do is, if you look at a building, an existing building, it will tell you how much carbon you would save by renovating the building and saving it, or tearing it down and building a more efficient building new, it'll give you the whole carbon count on both of those, so you can make informed decisions and show that to your client. So that we have not had that tool before. It's in beta version. I think it's going to come out very, very soon. It's called the CARE tool. Keep an eye on our website. As soon as it comes out, we'll make a big deal about it. But that will be one tool where you can actually show somebody, hey, this is not the way to go, if the numbers work out that way. So the CARE tool is one way to do it. I mean, just the savings in terms of structure, the money has to be huge. I don't know. I just think if it's not happening naturally, which I would hope it would, because it'd be a savings, be a cost savings, infrastructure savings, you name it, then I think you're going to need government intervention, and the city's going to have to legislate. You're going to have to show us how much infrastructure it's going to take to, for this new building, what the embodied carbon is. You're starting to see cities now with embodied carbon budgets. And if you try to rip something down and then replace it with something new, your budget between ripping, getting rid of all of that other carbon, and then adding all this, and you add both of those up, the number would be out of control. So you may not be able to do it. So I think we're going to start to see that. We're starting to see that in a number of cities where they're regulating embodied carbon.
Absolutely. Yeah. And what happens to that building if they take it down, making sure that people are responsible for the next steps as well, the end of life, whether it's materials and so forth. All right, we have a couple more questions. I know we're getting near the end. An interesting one here had to do with the production of solar panels. And Joan Lung was asking that her understanding was that one of the essential materials in producing a solar panel is actually plastic. And so she's wondering if we might be creating another environmental hazard as we become focused on solar panels.
Yeah, that's not an area I'm 100% familiar with. I was relying on Rocky Mountain Institute, which has done quite a bit of work in that area of different materials for panels and stuff, and rare earth materials, things like that. The latest study I saw from Amory Lovins was that there are very few, for example, rare earth material, not plastics though, rare earth materials used in the manufacture of solar panels and things like that, so that there's a misconception. I know we're beginning to see a lot of organic materials that are beginning to be used for different problems, and there are recyclable plastics that are now, we're beginning to see that take root in organic plastics made from organic material. So I would hope that we don't create another problem, but it's not. I've got to fess up. It's not my area of expertise. I would rely on others.
Yep. There's another question here, which is tangential. It relates to energy more than buildings, but this is our colleague Peter again. But basically saying, if we all move to electric vehicles, just like we're moving to electric buildings, we've just got to create a lot of power. And how do we know that that power that is being created and then being transferred quite a long way is not augmenting a problem, and that is actually part of a solution? I don't know if you have an opinion on that or thoughts.
Yeah, I would go back to what my colleague Peter does, and that is planning is going to be huge. And transit is going to be, a big piece of this. If we if we try to replicate what's going on in the US, that's not a good model where, you know, everybody has a car and these cars are huge. And even if we electrify them, they're still going to take quite a bit of energy to run, and battery storage and things like that. You know, it's one of the solutions, but I think the big solution is walkable. I mean, if you want the big solution, it's walkable communities, it's transit development, so that, you know, we're not relying on everyone having his own huge piece of metal, you know, driving around. That study of Ho Chi Minh City I thought was fascinating, where people do have a lot of mobility, use very, very little energy, and very, very little emissions by using, you know, things like motorizing bikes and you know, very, very small transportation devices. That was actually, I mean, I haven't read the study, but I was talking to Peter about it, and he said he just would have never thought that it would be less emissions and less energy to do that than bus rapid transit and things like that. That it came out, you know, less. I want to read the study and see where he comes up with all that. Yeah. So
and
I mean,
I'm sorry.
Everybody's doing something, you know, and coming up with all these incredible things. That's the beauty of what's going on now.
And that's a beautiful segue into our last question here, which is close to my heart as well, looking at these innovations and innovative solutions. You know, you're talking about solar panels. I'm waiting for graphene and these flexible materials to be available to us. I know scientists are working on that. And Fatima Assad has asked us, you know, she's honored that you have outlined some design criteria and what we can cut down on, you know, in terms of steel and concrete. But she's wondering, have we left the actual products and materials development in the hands of the manufacturers, who are also monopolizing some pricing? And for example, she's saying if she wants to use solar glazing, is it too expensive and then it gets shot down? Wondering if there's any initiatives to get some of these technologies more reasonably priced, and just in that vein of how do we support the innovation that will bring us to new solutions as opposed to just cutting down on old ones.
I think we're seeing a cycle now. I really do. And the cycle is, what happens is, as the price of, for example, solar panels goes down, and people start using it, and you're now starting to see a huge amount of R&D into new products, because everyone wants to sell something, right? So all of a sudden, solar glazing, where has been studied at the labs and everything, and it's now they're looking to commercialize it now. And as they commercialize it, then the price comes down. So as this technology, because it's now so prevalent, then there's a lot more money into R&D, because people are looking for new products to sell within that category. Photovoltaics. I would have never thought photovoltaics, but here I am in the Southwest. We have a drought going on. We have a water supply problem. We have reservoirs. As it gets hotter and the wind blows, the reservoirs dry up, our water supply dries up. If we take solar panels and float them on the reservoirs, we cut down on the wind, we cut down on the solar that hits the reservoirs and begins to evaporate all that water, and we preserve our water supply while we build out an energy supply for the city, right, that we can sell. So essentially, we're solving two problems at no cost, because we can finance the solar and recoup it by selling the energy for the city. So that's something we'll propose to the city now on how we address our water problem. There's now wind that we're now looking to put out in the deep oceans. Wind farms in the deep oceans, you wouldn't even see them. And that's becoming viable now. Very, very small scale winds, but thousands of them now, in the deep oceans. All these things are becoming viable because that's what we're going to, and the cost keeps dropping like crazy. Renewables are the only costs that keep going down. Fossil fuels go up, nuclear goes up, all of that goes up. Every single year, renewables go down, storage goes down, and we're beginning to see all sorts of innovation because people want to supply that and want to innovate. So, the laboratories in China and US and all in Europe, South Africa, they're all looking for new ways to do things.
And is there a place that our colleagues can find some of this most recent innovation that do you have something in your palette, or is there a place that people can go to join in on some new ideas?
I would sign up for our bulletins. Whenever we have something new, we usually try to put out a bulletin. And, we have thousands of people that get the bulletin, but you can go to architecture2030.org and sign up for our news bulletins. I think that's a good way to, to keep up and we put things out there. I would try to tune into the next two COPs in November, this November and the next November. I think you're going to see a lot of innovation being presented worldwide at the UN conferences. So that's another area and place that I would look for innovation. And then trying to think what else. The palette, we're due for an upgrade, so that's next. It's actually translated into Chinese and Spanish, so you can get it English, Spanish, Chinese online, but it's due for an upgrade too. So we've done one, but I think we need to do another one and get. Things are changing so fast. It's really really hard to keep up. But check with our website. Our website's really good, and we usually try to keep that up to date.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I noticed that some of our colleagues put their questions in the chat box instead of the Q&A, so apologies. We didn't get to see them until now, and our time is over. So I need to pass the speaker back to Florence to thank those who have made today possible. But thank you, Ed, for all your time and insights. Really appreciate it.
Yes.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Christine. Ed, I really appreciate the time that you spent with us today, and then the efforts that you have made in promoting the drawing the attentions to our colleagues and fellows here about the challenge and on the climatic change and on the roadmaps and the suggestion that you have given to us as designers, so that's to participate in helping to keep that 1.5 degrees. So thank you so much for your today's time and sharing your thoughts. It's very, very meaningful work that you are doing. And I hope that all the audience here today, after today's discussion, and also should start looking into the architecture 2030s and the commitments that you can also make to help with the climate change issues that we are facing. And just a little bit of updates to follow up on this idea of the sustainable material and bamboo. We'll be having a webinar called Super Bamboo. We will have a scientist from the City University of Hong Kong that is researching on how to make bamboo, which claims to be even stronger than steel. So they're going to do a little presentation together with a discussion from the manufacturers of what are the concerns or the criteria efforts that they have been making in pushing this very renewable material into the next stage. So stay tuned for our newsletters and announcement. Okay, thank you so much for today. Ed?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you all, Florence, Christina. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, and no, it's a new world out there. It's very exciting. It's actually an exciting time to be an architect, a designer, and a planner. So I think we're finally valued. We've probably actually become the most important discipline on the planet right now. So it's kind of nice to be in that position.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you again.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good day and a good night.